Hello and welcome to the webinar. This is a Washington, D.C. update on federal policy issues. This webinar is presented by the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association. The participants on today's webinar are the team from the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. I'm Caitlin Sickles. I work at Bracewell. My colleague Paul Nathanson is usually on these webinars as well, but he is not on today. So we miss Paul, but we do have the full team from the Franklin Partnership. Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik are on the webinar today. If this is your first webinar, you should know that the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell is the strategic communications firm that represents NTMA and PMA, and the Franklin Partnership is the on-the-ground lobbying team advocating for small and medium-sized manufacturers here in Washington, D.C. Today's webinar is also sponsored by Federated Insurance. So lots of thanks to the team at Federated Insurance for their support of this webinar program. And in fact, today we have Jason Kerr on. And I'm going to turn it over to Jason briefly for some remarks from him on behalf of Federated Insurance. Jason, go ahead.
Thank you, Caitlin. Everyone, hey, my name is Jason Kerr, Home Office Account Executive over at Federated Insurance. And on behalf of Federated Insurance, we are excited for the opportunity to sponsor today's webinar. So for nearly 120 years, Federated has supported and promoted the association movement, and today is exclusively recommended by over 500 state and national association and buying groups. Federated is extremely proud of our partnerships with PMA along with several other NTMA chapters. And so we applaud both PMA and NTMA for their efforts in advocacy and arranging for their One Voice webinar series. We are looking forward to today's webinar and continuing our mission to help your business succeed. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jason. And again, thank you to Federated Insurance for your support of PMA, NTMA, and this webinar content. So speaking of content, what do we have on the agenda today? As usual, you come to us for a quick 30 minutes and we fill it with as much content as you can take in that time. The team from the Franklin Partnership will talk through what's going on in the U.S. Congress. Spoiler alert, we do have a Speaker of the House. So what does that mean in terms of the legislation that we have all been waiting on? We'll give a update on regulatory issues, talk a little on workforce development, as well as some funding opportunities. And then at the end, we'll talk about trade and supply chain issues. So with that, I am going to turn it over to John. Give us some highlights of what is happening in Congress.
Caitlin, you gave away my big surprise. That white smoke was found. White smoke was found coming out of the House chamber, and that we do finally have a speaker. His name is Mike Johnson, 4-term member from Louisiana. If you want to learn more about him, be sure to listen to our Talking with One Voice podcast that we recorded last week, and we spent a lot of time talking about the new speaker. But since he's been in place, this is his first full week, he's released a very aggressive legislative agenda moving forward, and he's already heading into a few buzzsaws, but there's a number of ideas that he's laid out in the short term, medium term, and long term for the House. For example, they're still going to have to deal with many of the issues that Speaker McCarthy had to deal with. Supplemental appropriations bills for Iraq, Israel, Taiwan, border security issues. They got to figure out some sort of consensus on a continuing resolution that we're going to talk about in a little bit. The House hasn't passed their 12 appropriations bills, so they need to continue working on that. The House wants to negotiate with the Senate to pass the National Defense Authorization, the NDAA, and the Federal Aviation Administration. Then moving to December, they're going to continue on the appropriations process, and then hopefully get an agreement and get that past the final NDAA, Farm Bill, and maybe FAA. And then moving over to the spring, They're continuing appropriations, but the big thing in the spring is going to be determining FY25, fiscal year 25 spending levels, because that has been a real bone of contention within the Republican conference. And then we'll see if the House Republicans could pass a budget resolution. But Omar, as we have said time and time again, the key deadline is November 17th.
Yeah, that's right, John. And we'll see, what the speaker ends up doing, how long he ends up lasting, if it is going to be somebody that's going to be in for the longer term through the remainder of this Congress, because he's got that November 17 deadline coming up. Every bill that they're putting forward between now and then that does pass the House with mainly or only GOP votes will not move in the Senate. They're already saying they're going to ignore a number of the bills that they're coming over from the lower chamber up over to the Senate, and that's not really a surprise. And no matter what happens, as we've said on every webinar this year, you're going to need a bipartisan solution, not just for November 17th, but beyond. So as a refresher, they put a 48-day government extension beyond September 30th to get us to this point for November 17 to avoid the shutdown back at the end of the fiscal year. If they do not pass all of the 12 funding bills by November 17th, then either some of the agencies begin to shut down or they pass an extension. To John's point, they likely will pass an extension. The question is what is included in that, and is it going to include House Democrats or is it going to be GOP only when we get down to it? They're likely going to move just some Republican only bills in the near future, and once they have kind of placated some of the base, likely they'll get to serious negotiations in about the next end of next weekend probably is when you'll start seeing some serious action there, because they will need some bipartisan solution to pass all of these bills. And it's important not just for the government funding, but also for them serving as a vehicle for other legislation that is pending, including fixing the research and development tax issue on 174, reinstating bonus depreciation to 100%, and getting the EBITDA 163J fixed as well. So there's a number of things that are still hinging. John, I don't think he's going to get right now the punt that he wants past the December 31st deadline. I know there's a number of other triggers that were part of the June thing. I think those are irrelevant. The main question is, will the Senate allow them to go past December 31st? I think the Senate Republicans and Democrats are going to try to force the House to get something done by Christmas, but we'll see if that happens.
And that's going to force Republicans to back down from their very thrift spending proposals that reduce the federal expenditures to some sort of bipartisan compromise, which is what the Senate Appropriations Committee has in the Senate floor. They've been working on the Senate floor, a bipartisan compromise. And so that will be a big leap. If the House Republicans do that, I think they could potentially get something done by Christmas. But then to your original point is, will the speaker still be the speaker after that point? Because there will be many very conservative Republicans who are going to be upset if the House Republicans cave to higher spending levels in the end, which would get us out of town by Christmas.
Yeah, it was quite paralyzing to not have that speaker for as long as that we did, because now we had a number of other negotiations on hold on taxes because the speaker really does dictate what goes to the floor. And lastly, on taxes here, before we shift to workforce issues, the conversations on R&D do obviously continue. We couldn't really have much substantive discussions again without the speaker, but we do know that internally House Republicans are increasingly starting to talk among themselves about what can they live with, or are they just going to give up on SALT and other discussions and just go straight to talking to Senate Democrats. And they'll probably have to make that decision here in the next week or two. By Thanksgiving is where that one sits. On workforce, John, apprenticeship week's always a big deal. The White House has been pushing this quite a bit, and we've actually, we had MTMA, Roger Atkins was at the White House 1 year ago as part of this apprenticeship week event, but that's something, John, that's still being pushed quite a bit by this administration.
It's November 13th through 19th is National Apprenticeship Week. Each day, the administration is going to highlight different areas of focus. For example, a registered for youth, and that's ed background. Registered apprentices for youth on Monday. On Tuesday, they're going to do new and emerging industries. Then for the balance of the week, there's going to be registered apprenticeships focusing on underserved areas, registered apprenticeships for women, veterans, and federal employees. So each day, hopefully you will be seeing some sort of focus on the registered apprenticeship program during the week of November 13th.
And so for these, if you do have a robust, strong apprenticeship program that you would like to highlight, please, as always, reach out to Jenny at NTMA or at Connie at PMA. We see a couple of you folks on here we know very, very well have been quite active or serving on Labor Department and other apprenticeship boards as well. So appreciate all your involvement on there. Had a call with the Department of Education last Tuesday with regards to a number of their priorities and pushing out career awareness in manufacturing, and similar conversations with regards to registered apprenticeship, youth apprenticeship programs, K through 12 curriculum development, outreach that industry has been doing to those primarily elementary and middle school students as well. This year is something that the Department of Labor has pushed out along with the Department of Education's career awareness initiative that they've got going on that really gets into the focus. This isn't normal, folks. Some of us that comb through data for a living, they don't normally highlight machinists, tool and die makers, woodcutters, metal machine workers, fabricators. This isn't something we had to go looking for. They're actively spotlighting manufacturing careers on the Department of Labor website. And that certainly is a change, John, along with the playbook that they put out here as examples of what some people in communities across the country have been doing with American Rescue Plan Act funding, which is commonly known as some of the COVID funds that were out there.
Sure. These are just some areas that have had some very successful registered apprenticeship programs that the White House is highlighting. But we all know and love Ivy Tech in Indiana. And many of our manufacturers have utilized the tech school there in Indiana. And these are just some of the successful ones they're highlighting. I took particular interest in the Sky Harbor Airport registered apprenticeship program with regard to their child care at Sky Harbor Airport. So these are just some of the examples that the administration is promoting.
Yeah, so they're showing you that opportunities that are out there and what works. So for example, support services, community colleges, registered apprenticeships, those are three distinct and separate categories of funding that has been used and in ways that they can do in corroboration with some different entities and employers out there. So showing you examples of some of the federal funding that's being used, again, with the White House putting quite a bit of push. And in that call that I had with the Education Department, they really did stress some of the initiatives that the White House is pushing out on advanced manufacturing, workforce sprint. This is something we're talking to both PMA and NTMA about, signing on to and helping promote, where they're trying to increase the not just awareness, but trying to expand the products available to potential workers and employees, from apprenticeships to career and technical education to other programs that are out there. And again, trying to show what best practices there are out in the communities already in existence and ways that they can be supportive. So we encourage you to continue to track and see what's going on there. Again, it's one of those situations where for many, many years, we've been pushing on all White Houses to really understand the availability, importance of manufacturing careers, starting with the Trump administration and continuing to this. They definitely seem to have gotten the message on that one. But back to the other side of it, John, on the MOU between NLRB and OSHA, that's now written in regulatory problems.
When I first saw this headline, OSHA, NLRB, agreed to a memorandum of understanding, I thought that was a scary headline. But when you dug deeper, there are certain areas where OSHA and NLRB do overlap, for example, with regard to retaliation and whistleblowing. And so basically it's just interagency cooperation to make sure that those agencies, the right hand knows what the left hand is doing. So it's not that bad of a headline moving forward. But Omar, there's been a lot of discussion and some technical changes to something we've talked about on many of these webinars, is a third-party walkthrough.
Yeah, back to the OSHA one, it is important because what it shows is it's not just about information sharing, it's really about referrals. It's about the NLRB referring companies for investigation and enforcement action to OSHA, and OSHA giving a list to another agency that's in regular contact with employees about what to keep a lookout for. And so it is quite significant, as is this one on worker walk around, the comments that we've discussed in the past that are due now on November 13th instead of the initial October 30th deadline. The key takeaway here is under this proposed rule from OSHA, it would allow a third-party representative that would be authorized by even potentially a singular employee that would accompany the OSHA inspector on that in-person walk around. That designee from the employees could be a trial attorney, it could be a forensic expert, it could be an activist, it could be virtually anybody, because of the language that's in here says that the person is not limited to only those individuals with skills and knowledge similar to those experts like an industrial hygienist or others. So basically what it does is it removes the threshold by which you could have, quote, an expert. They no longer have to be an expert when they accompany OSHA. The saving here on this one is that OSHA would have the opportunity to say, no, they're necessary, or yes, they are necessary as part of this, as we're hearing that OSHA is not too thrilled. We were part of an SBA meeting on this last Wednesday, and then subsequently another meeting with OSHA where this and other issues came up as well. So just note that this is something that could be potentially quite problematic, especially if you have a singular or handful of employees that are looking to cause issues, and they're the ones themselves that are usually the prompt for an OSHA work or walk around to begin with. So just note that an employee may be doing two actions at once, pushing forward for the OSHA inspection and then gearing up to have a union representative accompany them, even if you're a non-union shop as well. Something to watch closely. Our coalition will be filing comments on that in a couple of weeks. And that, again, going back to a lot of the data, John, that comes up is something that the administration's been pushing hard for.
Other news on the labor front, the Department of Labor issued some of their late labor data. Unfair labor practices filings have increased 10% this past year. New union petitions are up 3%. Not a big surprise coming from an administration that has been strongly supportive of the labor union. Another issue that was released that we had been expecting for several months now is the joint employer final rule was issued. It takes effect on December 25th. Essentially, if an employer possesses direct or indirect control over one or more conditions of employment, and they lay out 7 different conditions of employment, you then would be considered a joint employer.
Yeah, and as you take a look at the effective date on this of December 26th, it's a pretty rapid turnaround. It was what we call a final rule. It's not proposed any longer. And for those of you that using temp workers or have some kind of a joint agreement across businesses, this is something that is important, especially when you break down those individuals. For example, do you have control over wages? Do you have control over hours of work, the tenure of employment, the working conditions that are out there as well. Note though on this one, the interpretation from the lawyer so far has been, you see right before the number 7, there's an and. The attorneys aren't really taking this as all 7. It's really going as, do you meet one or more of these conditions that are defined, and therefore you could be co-determined as an employer for the joint employer purposes under the new rule taking effect at the end of the year. A couple of you on this call, we do know use some kind of a temp or a PEO agency, so that's something to keep in mind, and at the very least, have a conversation with the PEO on where things might stand now that this is in the final rule stage as well. John, this is an oldie but goodie. If you want to talk about fiduciary rule, this one goes back to the Obama era.
I can't believe this issue is still going on. Another Department of Labor issued a proposed fiduciary rule. The intent here is to protect retirement investments from, those shady financial advisors. And this is an issue that's rather, while in some ways it makes a lot of sense, otherwise it's very controversial in Washington, and it basically avoids financial advisors from benefiting from some of the financial advice that they're providing to their investors. And so this is an issue that I know NAM has been involved in. We have had manufacturers testify on this issue. And as you said, this goes back to the Obama administration, highly controversial.
Yeah, a lot of the concern was that it would reduce the number of individuals that would be interested in working with small business primarily, and especially those that could be family run that are going to be on the 10 employees, less than that, where the individual just might not get usually the attention from a larger firm, but the individual would choose to do so just because anyway. So a few other things in there. EEOC, we talked about this in a previous file. Your filing should have been due, I believe, in September or even October. The EEOC pushed those back on your EEO1 report portal that is now closing on December 5th. Please make sure that you do your filings. A couple requirements here. If you have 100 or more employees during that pay period, also if you're a government contractor, hitting a couple checkpoints there, contracts of 50,000 or more, and then, or $500,000 or more, and then employees of 50 or more on that as well. So those 2 triggers for EEO1 for the private employers of 100 or more, and then government contractors of 50 or more, plus the 500K or more in government contracting there as well. This one is a very much of an interest. If you could please reach out to NTMA or PMA if you are still using trichloroethylene in your shops. This is not the first time that the EPA has gone after TCE, or as we call trichlor. When we last talked about this was early Obama, late W timeframe. Many folks have told us around 2007 they've begun starting to transition away from trichloroethylene. We've always warned once something gets on the EPA's list to ban, it usually remains there for some time until they finally get around to it. The EPA is in fact now working on moving away from TCE. They have said that industry has plenty of time to identify alternatives to that. The big concern here, as you can see the highlighted, the proposed ban that came out is a proposed ban on manufacture, processing, distribution for all TCE uses. Our understanding from many of you is you use it as a degreaser, you can use it as a cleaner, gaskets, all kinds of other things on molds, on dyes, in many areas like that as well. And from where the EPA is going through with it is some of its uses must be fully phased out within 1 year. There are some other uses that allow for a longer transition period depending on its uses and the substitutions that they have, or if you have certain government contracts, you can go on for a little bit longer time. But the effective removal of TCE from a shop without pure testing for safety and operability and chemical construct is pretty critical on a 12-month period. That's something to watch closely. You can find a link to the EPA's full proposed rule down there at the bottom, and they're also holding a hearing coming up on November 14th in about 2 weeks or so with regard to the proposed on TCE. When you register for this, which I did yesterday, you can go in and register either just to listen in, or you can register to file comments. And to speak publicly, they'll give you 60 seconds, 2 minutes. If you do choose to do so, please again, reach out to Connie at NTMA, or reach out to Christy at PMA or to Jenny at NTMA, and we'd love to talk to you a little bit more about that as well. John, jumping over to the IRS, we've been talking about the retention credit now for how long? And they're still going.
How long has the pandemic lasted? Over 3 years we've been dealing with this. But before I jump into this, I want to remind everybody, if anybody has a question, feel free to post a question in that lower right-hand box, and we'll try to answer your questions during the course of this webinar. But of course, we'll also have time at the end to answer any questions. So if you do have any questions, feel free to enter them in the box below. But what the IRS said was, if an employer has filed their claim for the employee retention credit that we're going to end, that you haven't been reimbursed yet, we're going to give you a pathway to withdraw your application in case you were unfairly convinced to file an ERC by a shady third-party consultant who we all know have popped up. So it's an effort to address fraud and abuse within the employee retention credit system. So you'll be able to withdraw your application and there'll be no penalty. And that's a way to protect employers.
Another area, sticking with the IRS and taxes on this one, they did a couple of things on here. So you recall we mentioned in the October webinar rather, that on September 15th, I believe it was, the IRS released a new form for the R&D tax credit, making a number of changes, including the subpart F, that are of concern. I still strongly encourage you all to talk to your CPA and CFOs about that new form. It's form 68 something that they came out with. This is separate. This is what we call a guidance. So in IRS terms, there's something called a notice, a guidance, interpretation, and rules. What this is, a guidance. A guidance typically tells taxpayers and tax preparers that the Department of Treasury is intending to put forward a rule, and that rule-making process will likely follow what the guidance puts out. The guidance does effectively have that force of law. It is not a full rule. They are telling you that they're about to put one, and here's what you should be doing between now and the time that you get that rule. So for those of you that are dealing with Section 174, this is the tax, the research and development tax. This is not the tax credit. That's Section 41. Section 174 is the one that creates the amortization and capitalization requirements, along with removing the ability to fully expense your R&D activities as you were permitted to do so through December 31st of 2021. So what the guidance is telling you here is not only are they putting out a proposed rule, but they're laying out two sets of categories. What are some of those specified research or experimental expenditures that are permitted under the 174, labor costs, materials and supplies that are not depreciable under 168, that's bonus depreciation, cost recovery allowances, patent costs, certain operation and management costs, some of the administrative there, and then they go through at costs that are not treated as expenditures for specified research or experimental purposes. And some of those are obvious, but then they get into definitely some more details than you've seen in the past. So those of you that are looking for a bridge with regards to guidance on 174, you now have it. This, however, the reason they did this as guidance and they did not do this as a rule is because they are considering whether or not Congress would make a change and undo the requirement under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So that's why this is a guidance as of right now, and it's not a rule. If we do get beyond the end of the calendar year and we do not have a fix for the R&D issue, then likely you could potentially see this turn into a proposed rule in the first quarter of next year. So again, going over your CPAs and your CFOs, if we are believing that Congress will fail to get something done, regardless, this is now your IRS guidance that you should be following. John, we want to do something a little bit different. I just wrote an article on this, but if you want to just set us up here on the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the taxes there, I can take it from there.
The IRS has released a number of energy tax incentives that were part of the Inflation Reduction Act, and here are some of them that are out there. If you are actively involved in electric vehicles or clean energy areas, there's likely something, potentially investment money, incentives to be available for you.
Yep. So what this is, the IRS is now trying to make sure that there's public awareness more than 1 year after the Inflation Reduction Act, which is largely termed the Democrats' climate bill, has been put out. There's buckets of money. If you're looking for federal cash, it's not hard to find between the ARPA, that's the COVID bill that we talked about, that is still putting out cash to communities for training and other activities. You've got the investment in infrastructure law bill, the IIJA, which is also called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, that is still putting cash out. There's good opportunities there if you are providing a component that might be part of a water infrastructure project and it's happening in the local area and you sell that. And that's an area where you could partner with some of the subcontractors there as well. There's also obviously the chips and semiconductor bill. We've talked about that recently with the under $300 million project funding just being released. And now over at the Department of Energy on some of the incentives. What these are is it goes well beyond just the manufacturing of the components for the renewable sectors. I would really look at this in 4 blocks here. If you're looking for just money savings, which a lot of it exists between now and 2032, you want to look at it, the product you make, for whom you're making it, how you're making it, what sources of energy you're using in that process, and then where you're located when you make it. Starting with the last part, where you're located, they look at underserved communities and areas, think hub zones. Many of those credits have been enhanced. When you look at the tax code in the sections of 45, 48, and all of them applying under section 38 under your general business deduction, then you're going to be, or credits, you're going to start looking at the different categories that they've expanded. They've either expanded existing provisions like 179D, for example, or they have added new ones. That's not on here. 179D, if you're looking to take your business and do some kind of retrofitting where you're going to improve the efficiency by at least 25% for that equipment that you're placing into service on your facility, think an HVAC, then you are eligible under 179D for an expensing, similar to the small business expensing. What's on this page are some of the IRA specific ones that will go in. If you're looking to reduce your carbon footprint for your facility by, again, changing some of your processes to capture some of the heat, if you're looking to take some of the heat energy and sequester it in some way or form, transfer it or sell it back, those all have some kind of a tax incentive available for you. If you are purchasing clean vehicles, meaning electric vehicles, for commercial purposes for your business, there are incentives there. In addition, if you start investing and put into service an electric vehicle charging station on your property, there is also section 30C that's available for you as well. But for this slide, definitely again encourage you to try to identify ways that you can bring some of this money back. Even if you get Republicans that take the Senate next year or see what happens in the House and Senate, many of these tax provisions will continue to remain in place regardless of what happens. President Trump could slow some of them down but many of the others, the money's out there, the tax incentives are there. You should definitely be working and trying to find ways to take advantage of them. We also wanted to point out some other grants that are coming out from the Department of Energy. We have one of our forging companies actually secured 31,114 of these dollars for LED work. Again, they're based in Wisconsin. It's one of those you are going to do the work anyway, and there are federal dollars that are out there specifically for small and medium-sized manufacturers, and this is an example of one where the first round was just closed and just awarded to 41 businesses just like yours, and December 31st is the deadline for the next round that is out there. I strongly encourage you to take a look at it, identify if there's some activities. If you can get some savings out of this webinar, you just paid your dues for multiple years to come. So please encourage you all to take a look at seeing what some of the opportunities are. You should be aware that both NTMA and PMA post our monthly grants tracking matrix website that's available to see what you can do to bring home some of those opportunities for you as well. John, let's just jump into trade and supply chains.
I was just going to raise one more point about these manufacturing grants for small manufacturers. It's a grant of up to $300,000, so with a 50% cost share. So this is some serious money that everybody should take advantage of. Sorry, Omar, what were you going to say?
Transitioning to you to talk about shortages according to industry. So Beige Book that I know I read religiously. I don't know about you.
Well, the Beige Book issued by the Federal Reserve, this is really talk about economic activity throughout the country, and they've got a number of offices around the country. And here in the recent Beige Book, it did indicate that the economy is seeing a reduction of shortages in the supply chain. So that's one positive step moving forward, which is, it's not the reason, but it's part of the discussion of when the Federal Reserve is going to determine whether they're going to raise interest rates. And many of you already know that the Federal Reserve announced this week that they are keeping interest rates at the constant level. But we're also seeing an increase of construction spending in manufacturing. But this is largely as a result of increased construction in the electric vehicle and battery factories moving forward. So these are just some economic symbols, signs out there.
Yeah, what we're seeing with this slide actually shows that we're seeing a leveling off in construction spending and investment on manufacturing, and that is not a surprise considering some of the softening that we've seen elsewhere. What the Beige Book is, it's an interview with you all. It's not a bunch of government economists telling you what they think. The Beige Book is an interview with the different regional federal banks, with actual manufacturers, with retailers, with farmers, with different industry that's out there, with insurance, real estate, to get a sense of what the actual people or the real people you all are saying and hearing out there, and that's why it's important to track that as well. Obviously, the ISM numbers came out, not as great, 46.7%. Obviously, anything below 50% is contraction, and we're seeing some of those numbers. Again, both PMA and NTMA have put out some of their numbers where you can take a look at that. As we get ready to wrap up, we don't want to keep you all too much longer. We've got a few trade issues here just to touch on. An extension was granted in the Section 301 tariff court case. What this is the Section 301 tariffs that were imposed starting in 2018 by former President Trump, imposed a tariff of 25 and 7.5% on Chinese imports on lists 1 and 2. Then what they did, without going through a full notice and comment period, was expand those tariffs to lists 3 and 4A. There's a group of folks that sued, over 4,100 products being included, without going through a formal process, and that's what this is about. If you are a party to that case and the court comes back and says they violated the process, then you are eligible for recourse and getting your money back on any tariffs that you paid. It's still a long shot. It's still working through the process. The court did grant the U.S. government additional time to respond to the importer's case, to the appeal that's out there. On October 20th, the U.S. President Biden met with his counterparts for the EU Council and the EU Commission, and we went to the European Commission, European Council, and they did not come to an agreement on a carbon-based tariff system. They are still going to work towards that. In a future webinar, we'll get in more details on it. But effectively, what the timeline is, they're going to now wait for the U.S. International Trade Commission report to come out in January 2025 on the carbon-based footprint on greenhouse gas emissions for the steel, aluminum, and some derivative industries. And then they'll be ready to move forward and implement something with the Europeans when their carbon adjustment border mechanism fully takes effect in 2026. In the interim, before now and then, the U.S. is asking for the EU to start placing tariffs on excess steel coming in from non-market economies, such as China. And that's ultimately where we see things heading now. And they're going to try to get a deal here on that by the end of the year. And Caitlin, we'll get ready to turn it over to you. But over on the 232 side of things here as well, our coalition partners did file comments on October 12th to the Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security, weighing in with them on that 232 steel and aluminum exclusion process. As Paul talked about last month, they were looking at 4 major changes in that system. A couple of them actually pretty good. We made our comments in there as well. This is a separate issue. There were 2 import cases as well that get focused on derivatives, dealing with nails, fasteners, and other equipment and products made out of steel subject to the 232 tariffs. The Supreme Court effectively put a nail in this coffin and said, no, the president does have the authority under the 1962 law to be able to move forward and impose these tariffs on national security grounds. There is one more chance at it to try to get the Supreme Court to rule that President Trump exceeded his authority on the 232. That is unlikely to succeed, but that one is still pending, but out there. But on that media side, it has been helpful. Every time there's a court case out there, it does generate some attention and make sure that it keeps this issue alive, especially with the negotiations that are going to be continuing going through the end of the year. So Caitlin, I mean, having this being out in the media is helpful to us since most folks keep focusing on other issues, but steel and aluminum tariffs are still critical.
Yeah, absolutely. We are always grateful to members who want to participate in media interviews. Both associations provide opportunities for you to let the association know that you would be interested in participating in interviews, or of course you can just reach out to Paul or me directly. And it's very helpful on this issue, as well as we did some media interviews around the UAW labor negotiations, which were important, of course, for a variety of manufacturers who are small and medium-sized companies, but are suppliers to the bigger automotive companies. So we had media around that too, and I think that was helpful in driving the importance of that narrative. The only other thing I'll flag on the media side, we have a slide here that has a really nice media coverage of an award that Roy Sweatman down in Florida received recently. Oftentimes members, both of NTMA and PMA, are featured in media coverage. And when that happens, we're always grateful for the associations or members to share that coverage with us, so that we can include it in our promotional materials and put it on the website and that kind of thing. But for folks who hadn't seen it, this is a real nice article, press release and article about Roy, about his business, and about the work that he's done, particularly in his community around the issue that we all talk about so often on workforce development. There's a nice quote here about his efforts to bring in students, families, teachers into his facility for tours. That, of course, is an important part of the work that all of you do as members of NTMA and PMA. It's a nice story, so I thought we'd call it out here in the media section. Let me give one more plug here for the One Voice podcast. John referred to it earlier when we were talking about the speaker showdown. On our podcast, Talking with One Voice, you can get it wherever you find your podcast. We talk more about manufacturing and the policy issues that impact manufacturing. We also talk a little bit of politics on the podcast, which of course you will have more politics coverage as we head on the road to 2024. So do check out that podcast. If you are interested, you can subscribe. That'll download the new episodes right to your device, wherever you listen.
Thanks everybody for joining us today. Sorry we ran a little bit late. As always, feel free and please do so. Contribute, see how you can support these ongoing webinars and our activities here in Washington, D.C. As always, please type in any questions on the right-hand side here. We'll stay on the line just for a little bit longer. Again, we did go a little bit long because we wanted to really emphasize some of those funding opportunities and remind people about some of the tax incentives that are aware. Please take those 2 or 3 slides and share with your colleagues, your CPA firms, and your others, especially when it comes to some state and local matches as well. Again, feel free to type in any questions. Not seeing any come through. You know how to reach us. Please feel free anytime. And our next webinar will be on that first Friday in December. I believe it's December 3rd or so, that first Friday then. Look forward to talking to you then. Thank you everyone for joining us today.